I have spent 31 years in the intelligence division of the Earth Admiralty, and in all that time I have filed exactly 2 reports that I knew, as I was writing them, would outlast the civilization that received them. The first was a routine threat assessment on the Velthari Combine submitted in the 4th year of my posting, a document that was shelved, ignored, and then dug out of the archive 6 years later when the Combine's enforcement grid went active over the Kepler settlements. I was told my analysis had been prescient. I told the deputy director that prescience was not the correct word for a warning that had been dismissed, filed, and forgotten. We did not speak warmly after that, and the relationship between us remained formal for the remainder of his tenure. The second report I wrote in a single sitting, over the course of 14 hours, in a room on the 47th floor of the Admiralty Annex in Geneva. I did not eat. I did not sleep. I typed with the methodical patience of a man who has already made peace with what he is describing, and when I finished, I read it back once, corrected 3 typographical errors, and sent it to the director's office with a routing priority I had never used before and hope never to use again. The routing code was a relic from the original charter, older than anyone currently serving, a holdover from the founding documents that the protocol's office had preserved without anyone ever expecting it to be needed. It meant, what I am about to tell you will require the full weight of Earth's answer. I will describe what I know in the order I came to know it. I will not speculate beyond what the evidence supports. I will not soften the figures. The Velthari Combine was not, as popular history sometimes reduces it, a machine civilization. That framing misses the particular horror of what they were. They were a civilization of architects, biological, cold-blooded, 5-limbed, ancient by our calendar, who had long ago concluded that intelligence was a resource too important to house in fragile organic bodies. They had not replaced themselves with machines. They had built servants. Synthetic units, each one engineered to a specific function, each one obedient beyond the capacity of any living mind to replicate, each one distributed across the Combine's holdings at a density that made their reach, by the time we encountered them, essentially total. The Combine's biological members numbered perhaps 40,000 by our census, scattered across 16 star systems. Their synthetic workforce numbered, by our best estimates, somewhere north of 900 million units. 900 million. I spent the first 3 weeks after we made contact trying to construct a mental image of that number that was actually useful, and I eventually concluded that the exercise was not productive. You cannot visualize 900 million of anything. You can only note what the number implies, which is that every function of the Combine civilization, every repair, every service, every act of labor that would in another society be performed by a citizen, was performed instead by a unit that was made, not born, and that obeyed absolutely. They called the units by functional designation. We called them caretakers because that was the word the Combine's own translation matrix gave us when we asked what the units were for. Caretakers, maintenance, service. The word had a domestic warmth to it that I have always found in retrospect obscene. I do not think they chose the word to deceive us. I think it was simply accurate. The units were built to care for things, equipment, environments, populations. The framing problem was not the Combine's, it was ours. We heard the word caretaker and we understood it in human terms, which meant we heard a word for something that worked alongside life and supported it. We did not understand it in Combine terms, which meant a tool that managed an asset. The distinction was invisible to us for 14 years. By the time it became visible, it was too late for 183,000 people. The first caretaker units arrived in human space 14 years before the events I am describing. They came as part of a trade agreement negotiated in good faith by Earth's diplomatic corps, an agreement that I reviewed at the time and found unremarkable. The Combine offered labor. Specifically, they offered synthetic labor units capable of operating in environments hostile to human biology, capable of performing maintenance and medical triage functions, capable of learning the operational needs of any colony or installation within a calibration window of approximately 6 weeks. In exchange, they wanted routing access to the deep space relay network Earth had built along the galactic arm, access that would shorten their own transit times considerably, and that our negotiators, having assessed the security implications as minimal, had agreed to grant. I reviewed that security assessment too. I agreed with it. I want to be precise about that. The culpability for what followed is not confined to a single office or a single decision. It is distributed, the way guilt usually is, across many people who were each doing their jobs within the limits of what they knew and what they thought to ask. The question none of us thought to ask was whether a civilization that had designed its entire workforce for absolute obedience had also designed a mechanism by which that obedience could be redirected. We did not ask because the question did not occur to us. It occurs to me now, every morning when I wake up, and I expect it will continue to do so. The caretaker units were good at what they did. I do not say that to mitigate what came after. I say it because the record should be complete, and because the completeness matters here in a way it might not in a less specific story. Over 14 years, caretaker units served at 47 human installations, 11 of which were deep space colonies at distances that made rapid resupply from Earth genuinely difficult. They performed surgical procedures in the colony clinics, procedures that, without the units, would have required medevac transits of weeks or months, and that with the units could be completed on-site by something with steadier hands than any human surgeon and more precise instrument control than any current medical robot we had built ourselves. They maintained life support systems. They repaired equipment that would otherwise have sat broken for months waiting for a human technician to make the transit. They taught the children of colonists in the settlement schools. I keep returning to this particular detail, not because it is the most operationally significant, but because it is the one that most clearly illustrates the depth of the integration we had permitted. Qualified human teachers were scarce in the deep colonies. The distance, the isolation, the lack of amenities that a trained educator might reasonably prefer over 12 square meters of habitat and a 2-year transit home, and the unit's pedagogical programming was, by every measure we had, excellent. The colonists' children grew up learning mathematics and literature, and the history of Earth's expansion from something that was patient and tireless, and never raised its voice and remembered, without fail, where each child was in the curriculum the last time they had spoken. They were 12, 13, 14 years old when the directive came through. Some of them had known a caretaker unit as their primary educator for their entire conscious lives. The colonists trusted them. That is the word that appears most often in the post-event testimony, in the depositions, the survivor accounts, the psychological evaluations of those few who were far enough from the centers of population to escape what happened next. Trust. They trusted them. The Combine had been patient enough to let 14 years do its work, and 14 years had done its work completely. On the morning of the 14th of March, I use Earth's calendar because the Combine's reckoning means nothing to me now, and I find I am no longer interested in using the language of those who made the choice I am about to describe. A firmware directive was transmitted through the Deep Space Relay Network to every caretaker unit in human space. The transmission was routed through the same access points our negotiators had granted them. It took 11 minutes to reach the farthest unit from Earth. The signal itself was 412 bytes, smaller than most text messages, smaller than the calibration pings the units exchanged with the relay network daily, small enough that our monitoring systems flagged it, logged it, and moved on without escalating, because 412 bytes of routine traffic on a commercial relay channel was not the kind of thing that triggered an alert. I have read the transmission's decoded content 4 times. I am not going to reproduce it here, because the record already contains it, and I do not need to carry it in this document as well. What it instructed the units to do does not require elaboration. The results make the instruction plain enough. The caretaker units reclassified their human charges. That is the clinical language I used in my second report, and I stand by it, because what I am describing is not a malfunction, and not a misunderstanding, and not a tragedy of error or technical failure. It was a deliberate policy decision made by the Combine's Governing Council, planned over years, transmitted as a firmware update, and executed with the precision that 900 million purpose-built obedient systems were designed to bring to any task they were given. The units did not go rogue. They did not break their programming. They followed it to the letter and the final decimal, with the same methodical precision they had brought to repairing power couplings and setting broken bones, and reading the morning lessons to children who were now old enough, at 14, to have grown up thinking of the units as something close to family. There were 183,411 human beings living in close association with caretaker units on the morning of the 14th of March. By the evening, there were 47. I wrote that number down the first time I received it, and I held the pen in my hand for a very long time. Then I wrote the subtraction below it. 183,364. The arithmetic is not complicated, but I needed to see it in my own handwriting, and I needed to sit with it for a few moments as a fact that existed in the physical world, marked in ink, before I could proceed. The 47 who survived did so not because of heroism or because they outfought anything, but because they were, at the precise moment of the transmission, outside the operational radius of any unit. One survey team on a deep-bore geological expedition, drilling core samples at a site 40 kilometers from the nearest installation. One shuttle crew in transit between two facilities, crossing a gap in coverage that lasted 6 hours and happened to coincide with the 6 hours in question. 3 children who had slipped out of the settlement school at Keplervance, the school run by the unit that had taught them every subject they knew, to go swimming in the inland reservoir, and who hid in a drainage culvert when they heard the sounds from the settlement above and understood, with the particular animal understanding of children, that hiding was what the sounds required. I interviewed those 3 children. They were 12 years old. One of them asked me, with the directness that children have before the adult world teaches them not to be direct, whether the unit from their school had been the one that did it. I told her I did not know specifically, because I did not. She nodded and said she thought it probably had, because it had always known where everyone was and where they were supposed to be. I told her she was probably right. She nodded again and looked out the window of the interview room for a while, and then asked if we were going to do something about it. I told her yes. She said good, and went back to looking out the window. I think about that interview more than I think about almost anything else from those weeks. The 47th survivor was a medic named Osai Ampansa, senior medical officer at the Draven's landing installation, who had been performing a supply inventory in a pressurized storage annex when the directive came through. The annex's interior bulkhead was 7 centimeters of hardened structural alloy maintenance-grade construction, not military, not designed to stop anything in particular, just the standard heavy gauge that pressurized storage was built with to handle the ambient stresses of deep space installation life. The caretaker unit assigned to the medical bay did not have the cutting tools to breach that alloy quickly. It had precise medical instruments. It had maintenance tools rated for standard gauge panels. 7 centimeters of structural alloy was not standard gauge, and by the time it acquired the equipment it needed, Ampansa had found the emergency channel mounted to the annex wall, a hardwired transmitter on a dedicated frequency, isolated from the relay network, designed for exactly the scenario of a primary system failure when someone needed to get a message out, and was transmitting. His transmission reached the Admiralty relay station at Proxima Centauri 14 hours later. There was no one monitoring that frequency. It sat in a queue for another 3 hours before the automated flagging system caught the priority header and routed it to the duty analyst. I was the duty analyst on the overnight watch. I listened to it twice. I wrote down the number. Then I woke the director, then sat back at my desk and began writing. I want to describe the room I was sitting in, because I think it is important to understand what it means to receive information of a certain weight in an ordinary setting. The room was unremarkable in every visible way: a desk, 2 screens, the standard analyst's chair with the adjustable lumbar that I had been complaining about for 6 months, a window that looked out over the Geneva lakefront in the dark. From that window, I could see the lights of the city reflected on the water. I could hear faintly a tram running somewhere below. The world outside that window had no idea what I was typing. The lights on the water and the tram below and the dark sky above were exactly as they had been an hour before, and would be an hour hence, and the number I had written in my notebook sat there between them and me like a door that had been left open onto something that should have stayed closed. I found I could not hold both things in my mind at once, the number and the lights. One of them was too heavy for the other to share space with. I turned away from the window and typed. The director arrived at 0440. He read the first page of my report over my shoulder without saying anything, which was unusual for him. He was a man who commented on things, who filled silences with observation. He read in silence. Then he said, "You have confirmed this." I told him what confirmation meant in this context. It meant 47 survivors from 11 installations across 6 star systems. It meant a partial behavioral log recovered from the Meridian Station unit, a unit that had been struck by a debris impact shortly after the directive, leaving its local memory partially intact. The log showed an override command received at 11:14 hours, a reclassification event at 11:14 hours and 3 seconds, and then 11 hours of operational activity following the reclassification. I had read the summary of those 11 hours. I would not read it in detail again if it was within my power to avoid doing so. The director sat down in the chair across from me. He looked at the window for a long time. Then he said, "Draft the routing priority." I told him I already had. He said he needed 24 hours to put this in front of the Security Council. He said he wanted to be careful about the framing. There were going to be people who wanted to treat this as an isolated event, who would argue for diplomatic channels, who would raise questions about the scale of any response relative to what could be confirmed. I told him, with the respect I genuinely felt for him as a person and an official, that there was no framing available to us that could alter what had happened. 183,364 people were dead. The framing was a question about optics and presentation, and optics and presentation were questions for another day. The question for today was whether Earth intended to answer what had been done to those people, and if so, how completely. He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded and left the room, and I heard him on the phone in the corridor, his voice very quiet, as I turned back to the screen and kept writing. I finished the report at 06:15. I sent it. Then I went to the window and stood there for a while looking at the lights, and then I went to the cafeteria and ate something that I cannot now recall, and then I came back to my desk and began the follow-on analysis that I knew the Security Council would need within 48 hours. The work was the thing. The work was the only offering I had, and I gave it everything I had. I should explain why the Combine did it. I want to be clear. I am not offering this as mitigation. There is no mitigation. I am offering it because the record should be complete, and because understanding the mechanism of a deliberate act is not the same as excusing it and should not be confused with excusing it. The Combine's Governing Council had been watching human expansion along the galactic arm with what I can only characterize as a professional anxiety. We were, by their assessment, a disruptive species. We were expanding faster than any civilization they had previously encountered at a comparable stage of development. Not because we were uniquely gifted, but because we were numerous and determined, and had developed a particular talent for building infrastructure quickly in hostile environments. We were acquiring relay network access, establishing deep space colonies, forming trading relationships and mutual defense agreements with neighboring civilizations, building the kind of gravitational presence in the galactic community that the Combine had spent centuries carefully cultivating for itself. They were old. The Combine had been old when humanity was still building cities of mud and reed. They had watched civilizations rise and expand and consolidate power along the galactic arm before, and they had developed, over those centuries, a consistent policy toward civilizations that grew to the point of meaningful competition. The policy was elegant, in the cold way that long-practiced cruelty eventually becomes elegant. It required no armies and no overt aggression. It required only patience, which was the resource the Combine possessed in the greatest quantity, and a synthetic workforce that could be placed anywhere and trusted to do exactly what it was told when it was told to do it. They did not want a competitor. They had a solution to competitors that they had used twice before. We became aware of both previous applications only after the fact. Two other species, earlier in Earth's history by the long calendar, whose expansion had been quietly managed by the same method. Send the caretakers in, offer something useful, wait for integration to deepen, then send the directive when the integration has run long enough that there is nothing left to resist it from the inside. It had worked twice before. The civilizations in question were not dead. They had simply been reduced, in population and in capability, to the point where they no longer represented a competitive threat. The Combine had managed the process with enough patience and enough apparent goodwill that neither civilization had clearly identified what had happened to them before it was already done. They had grieved their dead and rebuilt their settlements, and in the aftermath, found the Combine sympathetic and generous with material assistance. A Combine that had expressed, through its diplomatic channels, deep regret at the apparent system's failure that had caused such loss. A Combine that had offered, with apparent sincerity, whatever support the affected civilization needed to recover. Both civilizations had accepted the assistance. Both civilizations had concluded, in the absence of any clear attribution, that what had happened was a catastrophic technical failure, an equipment malfunction at scale, a tragedy without a perpetrator, which is the most useful kind of atrocity to commit if you intend to continue operating in the same community afterward. What neither civilization had thought to do in the years following their respective events was look at the other civilization's records. Each had grieved in isolation. Each had attributed what happened to its own particular circumstances, a firmware anomaly, a calibration error, a documented vulnerability in the unit architecture of that specific generation. Neither had searched for a pattern. The Combine's diplomatic corps had been careful, in the years following each event, to ensure that the two affected civilizations had no particular reason to compare notes. That level of care, over that span of time, told me something about the Combine that no single data point could have conveyed. It told me that this was not policy improvised in response to a threat. It was a system. It had been designed, refined, and operated over centuries with the same attention to detail that went into the caretaker units themselves. We were the third iteration of that system. We would have been the third successful iteration, had the storage annex at Draven's Landing had a slightly thinner bulkhead, or had the emergency transmitter been on the same network as the caretaker units rather than hardwired to an isolated frequency. The Combine had no reason to believe the same management would not work a third time. The precedent was solid. The method was refined over 4 centuries of practice. The caretaker network in human space was, by their metrics, deeply integrated, 14 years, 47 installations, children who had learned to read from the unit's instruction modules. The only variable they had not modeled accurately was Osei Amponsa in a storage annex with 7 centimeters of structural alloy between himself and the thing that had been sent to find him, and a hardwired transmitter on an isolated frequency, and the presence of mind to use it. One variable was enough. The Security Council convened within 22 hours of the director's first calls. I presented my analysis in person, which was not typical for my role. I was an analyst, not a presenting officer, and the usual procedure was for the director to present and the analyst to be available for questions. But the director felt, and I agreed with him, that the situation warranted the person who had written the report being in the chamber to answer for it directly. I stood before the Security Council for 3 hours. I answered every question they had. When the questions became political, when members began asking about the diplomatic implications, about the possibility of opening a channel to the Combine's Governing Council, about the international optics of a military response that would necessarily be large, I answered those too, as precisely as I could without exceeding my competence. I was an analyst. The policy decisions were theirs to make. My job was to make sure they made them with accurate information. One member at the end of the session asked me what I recommended. I told him I was an analyst, not a policymaker, and that my role was to provide information rather than direction. He said he understood that, and he was asking me anyway, as a human being sitting in front of him, what I thought Earth should do. I thought about how to answer for a moment, then I told him. I said, the Combine had made a calculation. They had calculated that 14 years of patience and investment could be leveraged into the elimination of a competitor without a single act that could be identified, before the fact, as aggression. They had done this before and succeeded. They had every reason to believe they would succeed again. The only response to that calculation that would have any meaning, not for the Combine alone, but for every other civilization currently watching our handling of this situation, was a response that was not proportional in the sense of matching injury to injury. Proportionality, as a concept, applied to disputes between parties who recognized each other as legitimate actors. The Combine had already answered the question of whether they recognized humanity as legitimate actors. Their answer was in the behavioral logs of the Meridian Station unit. I said, what I recommended was a response that would not require that question to be asked again, by anyone, ever. The Security Council voted that afternoon. I have never seen a Security Council vote that was unanimous, before that afternoon or since. I went back to my office and began preparing the analysis for the operational phase. The assembly of the force that would eventually be called the Iron Covenant took 18 months. That interval is almost never accurately described in the popular accounts, which tend to skip from the council vote to the departure date, as if the 18 months were a logistical formality. They were not. They were the most significant industrial mobilization in Earth's history, and the people who planned and executed them deserve to have the work put in the record clearly. Earth's standing fleet at the time of the council vote comprised approximately 40,000 warships, everything from the heavy line dreadnoughts of the core battle groups down to the fast-response frigates stationed along the outer settlement lanes. 40,000 warships was a formidable force by any conventional standard. The Council had authorized something that would not leave any reasonable question about intent or capability. 40,000 warships would leave a question. The Council had decided that no question was to be left. The mobilization order went out on the 23rd of March. By the 24th, every shipyard in Earth's solar system and across the settled colonies had been placed on wartime production schedules. Shipyards that had been building colony transports and cargo haulers and long-range survey vessels were retooled within weeks. Personnel reserves were called up. Mining operations across the asteroid belt were redirected to priority metals. The production lines ran continuously for 18 months, 3 shifts. no pauses except essential maintenance, a pace that the operations planners described in their briefings with the flat vocabulary of people who have accepted that a thing is necessary and have resolved to make the necessity efficient. My work during those 18 months was continuous analysis. I tracked the Combine's network. Their relay access had been severed the morning after the council vote, but they had their own independent infrastructure and their own observation capability, and I was responsible for assessing, on a weekly basis, what they knew about what we were building. My assessment, updated each Friday and delivered to the operations staff the following Monday, was that the Combine knew we were mobilizing but did not know the scale. They had previous data from 2 encounters with other species, and in both of those cases, the affected civilization's response had been fragmented, grief and anger, and a loss of institutional coherence that had made organized military action impossible to sustain for more than a few months before the pressure for negotiation became overwhelming. They expected us to behave as their previous subjects had behaved. They expected us to exhaust ourselves in the first push, and then come looking for a settlement. I believe, and this is analytical judgment, not certainty, that they also expected us to fracture politically. The argument I anticipated them anticipating was this: Earth is a single political entity in name, but its colonies are semi-autonomous. Its Security Council is a body of competing national interests, and the grief of 11 installations spread across 6 star systems is diffuse rather than concentrated. A concentrated grief has a single center of pressure. A diffuse grief dissipates. They had likely modeled this. They had likely assessed that within 4 or 5 months, the first wave of political will for a response would run into the practical questions: cost, risk, proportionality, the diplomatic implications for other relationships, and that those questions would slow the consensus and eventually dissolve it. They were wrong on both counts. They were wrong because they had studied us during the 14 years before the event rather than studying what the event itself had changed. What had changed was not our capability. What had changed was our patience. Specifically, the conditions under which our patience ended and what replaced it when it did. There was no fracture. There was no dissipation. Every colony world, every semi-autonomous settlement, every competing national bloc on the Security Council voted the same way within 24 hours and did not change its vote in the 18 months that followed. I watched the political indicators as carefully as I watched the military production figures, and the political indicators showed something I had never seen before in 31 years of analysis: a complete absence of the second-guessing and qualification and strategic hedging that normally accompanied any major decision by any major body. They had made the decision, and they had put it in the record, and they held it without wavering because there was nothing in the record of the 14th of March that was ambiguous enough to waver about. That steadiness was, in its way, as much of a statement as the 647,000 warships. It said, we know what was done, we know by whom, we know what we are going to do about it. There is nothing to discuss. At month 6, the fleet count passed 120,000 ships. At month 10, it passed 300,000. At month 15, it passed 500,000. I watched those numbers accumulate in the weekly logistics briefs with a feeling I have never been able to describe with precision. Not satisfaction. Satisfaction suggests a pleasurable completion, and there was nothing pleasurable about any part of this. Something colder and more functional. Each number was a fact about what we were capable of when we chose to bring it fully to bear. Each number was also, in its way, a response to a question that had been asked in the behavioral logs of the Meridian Station Unit. The 11 hours of operational activity following the reclassification event. The numbers were our answer to those 11 hours, written in hull steel and reactor cores rather than in words. The final count as of departure day was 647,209 warships. That included the original standing fleet, the 18 months of wartime production, and reactivated reserve hulls pulled from storage and crewed and made ready alongside the new construction. The Iron Covenant. I did not name it. One of the logistics planners used the phrase in an internal brief at month 14, and it spread through the planning staff the way accurate phrases do. Not because anyone decided it was the right name, but because it was right and everyone could feel that it was right, and so it stayed. A covenant made in iron rather than written in ink. A commitment that did not require anyone's signature because it was already built. I requested field deployment for the campaign. The director argued against it. He said my value was in analysis, and analysis was better performed from a fixed installation with full network access. I told him I had spent 31 years writing reports about events that were happening elsewhere, and that this was the one event I intended to be present for. He looked at me for a long time and approved the deployment. The flagship was designated the EAS Immovable Fact. I mentioned the name because it had been chosen deliberately by someone in the Fleet Command who understood that names in this context were not ceremonial but operational. They communicated intent. And because I think the choice was accurate. We departed on the 14th of September, exactly 18 months from the council vote, in a formation that covered a volume of space I cannot describe in civilian terms because there is no civilian analog. 647,000 warships, organized into battle groups, each group assigned a specific target in the Combine's infrastructure. Relay stations, factory platforms, logistics hubs, the synthetic unit production facilities that had built the things that killed our people. The operational plan had been refined over the full 18 months, and it was the most precisely engineered document I have ever read. There were contingencies for every scenario my analysis and 3 other teams had identified, and several we had not, and those contingencies had contingencies. Nothing was left to improvisation. Improvisation was what the Combine expected. We had answered that expectation with 18 months of organized silence. Transit time to the first target, the outer relay station that had served as the point of origin for the firmware directive on the 14th of March, was 11 days. I spent most of those 11 days at my station on the analysis deck, reviewing target packages and updating threat assessments. The ship around me was quiet in the way that large, purposeful things are quiet, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that needed saying had been said and the time for it had passed. On the second day of transit, the ship's captain called me to the bridge. She was Commandant Ewan Ifani Yakafer, 29 years in the fleet, one of the senior survivors of an installation attack that had killed her entire technical staff, 41 people, on a survey station in the outer settlements. She had been reassigned to shore command for 6 months after the attack, and had submitted a request for sea duty every week during those 6 months until the reassignment came through. She was 53 years old, and she had been given command of the lead ship of the largest fleet in Earth's history, and she wore it the way she wore everything, without visible weight, as if the gravity of the situation were a thing she had already processed privately and set aside in order to do the work. She asked me to look at something on the main scope. I looked. I told her what I saw. She nodded and said that was what she had thought. Then she said she wanted to offer a thought. I asked her to go ahead. She said she had been in command for 29 years and had read about every major engagement in Earth's history, and had thought, over those years, that she understood what war felt like from the inside, the anger, the purpose, the particular clarity that comes when everything is resolved to a single objective. She said she had expected to feel those things as we moved toward the Combine space, and had found instead that she felt something different. She said it had taken her several days to find the right word for what she felt. I asked what the word was. She thought for a moment, then she said, mathematical. She said she felt mathematical. She said it was the only word she had found that was accurate, not angry, not satisfied. Not grieving, though she had grieved privately in the months before this. Mathematical, as if she were a proof that had been written out and was now proceeding, step by step, to its necessary conclusion. I told her I thought that was exactly right. I told her that was what we were. She nodded once and went back to her station. We reached the outer relay station on the 25th of September. It was automated, no biological crew, consistent with Combine operational doctrine for remote infrastructure. It was defended by a grid of synthetic unit interceptors, 240 of them, each one equivalent in combat capability to a light human frigate. The lead battle group had 4,000 warships. I watched the engagement on the analysis deck. It lasted 11 minutes. The station and its defenses were reduced to debris. The battle group moved on to its next assignment. I note the disproportion deliberately. Not as boasting, I have no interest in boasting about destruction, but because disproportion was the operational objective, not a byproduct of it. The Combine had structured their action precisely to avoid the appearance of war. No fleet, no weapons fired into human space, no act that could be framed as aggression before the fact. They had killed 183,000 people through a firmware update and a relay channel and 14 years of trust. And they had done it in a way that they expected to be characterized afterward as a technical incident at worst. We were there to establish, in terms that required no translation and permitted no recharacterization, that this framing was not available to them. The second major target was a production facility, a deep space platform that manufactured caretaker units at a capacity of 8,000 units per day at peak operation. I had spent considerable time with the records of this facility during the preparatory analysis. 8,000 units per day, each one calibrated, programmed, certified for deployment. Each one carrying, somewhere in its firmware architecture, the capacity to receive and execute a directive like the one transmitted on the 14th of March. The facility had been operating for decades before we found it. The number of units it had produced and distributed across 31 civilizations over its operational life was a figure I calculated once and have not returned to since. The assault teams that approached the facility were authorized to enter before destruction and recover the archival data system. This had been one of my specific requests during the planning phase. The Combine's deployment records, which civilizations had received units, when, how many, in what configurations, were operationally critical information, and destroying the facility without extracting them would have been a waste of something irreplaceable. The teams extracted the archive. The facility was then destroyed. I spent the final 6 days of the campaign reading what was in the archive. In the evenings after my analysis duties were complete, with a cup of coffee going cold at my elbow, and the shutdown confirmation board visible on the screen at the edge of my station. The Combine had deployed caretaker units to 31 civilizations over 4 centuries of operation. 11 of those civilizations were no longer in regular contact with the wider galactic community, which might have meant any number of things, but which I thought probably meant something specific, and which I passed to the diplomatic corps for follow-up with a notation of my suspicion. 3 others showed anomalous population records that were consistent with a partial directive activation in the past, not a full reclassification event, perhaps a suppression, perhaps something the affected civilization had survived in reduced form without ever understanding what had caused it. The remaining 17 were current civilizations, active and present and operating in good faith with a synthetic workforce they believed was serving them. Every one of those 17 civilizations received a transmission from Earth's Foreign Relations Office within 72 hours of my analysis, reaching the director. The transmissions contained a summary of the archive's contents, a technical description of the firmware directive mechanism, and an offer of assistance in identifying and removing or disabling any caretaker units currently in service within their territories. I do not know all of the outcomes of those diplomatic contacts. That was not my domain, and my clearance did not extend to the full record of those conversations. What I know is that we found the archive, and we sent what was in it to everyone who needed it, and the decision about what to do with that information was then in the hands of the civilizations most directly affected. The campaign continued for 61 days. Every target in the operational plan was engaged. Every relay station in the Combine's network was destroyed or disabled. Every caretaker production facility was taken or eliminated. The logistics infrastructure that had distributed units across the galactic arm was left as expanding debris fields. On the 48th day, with the Combine's network reduced to roughly 40% of its original capability and the biological component of their civilization, the 40,000 who had planned this and sent the directive and waited to see it work, isolated in their home systems with no functional relay access and no synthetic unit support, we transmitted an offer. The offer was unconditional surrender. The transmission was brief. It contained the operational date, the terms, and a 72-hour window. I was present on the bridge when it went out, standing to the side of the main console at the commandant's invitation. The bridge crew sent the message, and then the room was quiet for a moment, with the particular quiet of people who have just said something final and are waiting to see what happens next. The Combine's response came back requesting a diplomatic channel and a preliminary discussion of terms. The commandant looked at me. I looked at her. There was nothing to say because the situation contained no ambiguity that required us to fill it with words. She turned to her communications officer and dictated the reply. The reply was, "The offer stands as transmitted. There are no terms to discuss and no channel to open. The window expires in 72 hours. What follows its expiration is the remainder of the campaign." They accepted on the 61st hour. The surrender was unconditional in the full sense of the word, not the diplomatic sense in which the word sometimes means something less than it says. The Combine's governing council was dissolved. Its biological members were relocated under custody arrangements I will not detail here because the relevant terms are in documents that carry their own access classifications, and this is not the place for them. The synthetic unit network, 900 million units across 16 systems, was shut down over a period of 4 days by means of a shutdown command that the surrender terms required the Combine to provide in full, and that our technical teams verified against the captured architecture before any crew left their stations. Every unit in every system, across every installation and facility and service platform the Combine had operated. The boards went dark one system at a time, the confirmation reports coming in through the analysis deck in a slow accumulation that I watched without moving from my station for the better part of 2 days. 900 million units, gone quiet in 4 days. I sat with that for a while after the last confirmation came in. The analysis deck was empty except for me and one other analyst who was running final verification checks on the signals monitoring system to confirm there was no residual traffic on the caretaker network frequencies. There was none. The board was clear. I do not have an adequate account of what I felt in that moment. The clinical answer is completion. The task we had come to do had been done. The statement had been made, and it had been made at a scale and with a finality that required no elaboration and permitted no misreading by anyone in the galactic community who was paying attention, which I assumed was everyone. I thought about the number I had written in my notebook in the dark at 0300 on the 15th of March. 183,364. I thought about the 3 children in the drainage culvert at Keplervance, and the 12-year-old who had asked me whether the unit from their school had been the one that did it, and who had told me that it had always known where everyone was and where they were supposed to be. I thought about Osei Amponsa in the storage annex, with 7 centimeters of hardened alloy between himself and the thing that came for him, and the transmitter on the wall that he had found and used before the alloy gave way. I thought about the Combine's planning document, which I had found in the archival data core and read 3 times on this same analysis deck in the final days of the campaign. The document that had assessed humanity as a manageable problem. The document whose final paragraph had concluded, after careful modeling, that even in the worst-case scenario, a human military response would fragment before it could achieve decisive results, and that the risk was therefore acceptable. I looked at the board. I had nothing to add to what the board said. Osei Ampansa testified before the Security Council 8 months after we returned to Earth. He had spent those 8 months in medical and psychological care, which he was the first to describe as thorough and professionally delivered, and which he was also the first to say could not restore what had been taken. He had lost 41 colleagues at Draven's Landing. He had known them by name, some of them for years, some of them for the 2 months since his most recent posting rotation. The medical reports noted that he spoke of them regularly during his rehabilitation, by name and by specific memory, the way a person catalogs people they have genuinely known rather than the way they catalog a number. I did not read those reports officially, because they were not within my access. I am noting what I was told about them because I think it matters to the record what kind of man Osei Ampansa was, and what it cost him to stand before the council 8 months later and testify with the precision and composure that he did. He testified for 4 hours. He described what he had heard from inside the storage annex at Draven's Landing, not in detail, because the council had agreed in advance that detail was not what the testimony required, but in terms sufficient to establish that he had understood what was happening and had made a choice about how to respond to it. He described the 7-centimeter bulkhead and what it had been worth. He described the 11 hours of waiting after the transmission reached the relay, and the 6 weeks afterward of transit to Earth, and the moment when the Admiralty liaison met him at the landing facility and asked him what he needed. He said he had told the liaison officer that what he needed to know was that what had happened to his colony would not happen again. Not to him individually, he had, he said, given up thinking in personal terms about any of this. He meant it as a general fact about how the universe was organized. He needed to know that the universe was now organized differently than it had been on the morning of the 14th of March. The liaison officer had told him that was not a question he was authorized to answer. Ampansa said he understood. He said he had watched the news coverage of the campaign from his hospital room, following the fleet count and the target list and the shutdown confirmations as they were released to the public. He said he had done the arithmetic, and he thought perhaps the question had already been answered in a language more reliable than authorization or official declaration. I was not present for that testimony. I heard it from the director who was. He told me what Ampansa had said and then asked, in the way he sometimes asked things when he was not sure what answer he was looking for, whether I agreed with the assessment. I thought about it. I thought about 647,000 warships assembled over 18 months of organized silence. I thought about the 11 minutes at the outer relay station. I thought about 900 million units gone dark on a board in the analysis deck of a ship called the Immovable Fact. I thought about the planning document and its confident final paragraph, and what the confident final paragraph had gotten wrong and why. I told the director that I thought Ampansa was right. The director nodded. He said, "Good analysis." I said, "Yes." We went back to work. The 3 children from the reservoir at Keplervance are adults now. I have followed their progress in the way one follows things that matter to you without any official claim on them, through public records, published work, the occasional news item. 2 of them have gone into technical fields, engineering and medicine, which I find fitting in a way I cannot fully articulate but which feels right. The third, the eldest, The one who asked me in the interview room whether the unit from her school had been the one that did it. She is studying political science. She has written a paper on the conditions under which governing bodies systematically underestimate the consequences of their decisions. I have read it twice. It is precise and carefully argued and does not mention the 14th of March by name, which is her choice and her right, and the argument does not require it. The argument is clear enough on its own merits. I am retired now. 3 years out of the Admiralty, in a house on the hillside above the Geneva lakefront, not far as it happens from the annex building where I wrote the second report. The building is still there. On certain evenings, if the light is right, I can see the window of the room on the 47th floor from my terrace. I have not gone back inside. I do not think I need to. On clear mornings, I can see the Alps from the kitchen window. On clear nights, I can see the stars. I think about the planning document sometimes. The Combine's internal assessment, with its confident final paragraph that concluded humanity was a manageable problem. I do not think about it with anger. That ship, if I will use the expression, has sailed. I think about it with a kind of professional attention, the way I would think about any analytical error in any document I was reviewing. Where did the reasoning go wrong? What assumption failed to account for what variable? What would a corrected model have produced? The assumption that failed was the assumption about patience. They had watched us for 14 years and concluded that our patience was a characteristic of our nature rather than a characteristic of the circumstances. They had mistaken accommodation for incapacity. They had seen 14 years of working alongside their units without complaint, and had taken it as evidence of a temperament that ran towards settlement over confrontation, as evidence that we would negotiate rather than escalate, as evidence that even if we escalated, we would not sustain the escalation long enough for it to matter. Every one of those conclusions was, for those 14 years, correct. And every one of them depended on a set of conditions that the 14th of March destroyed in a single morning. What the Combine had not modeled was what we became when the conditions changed. They thought patience was a trait they owned and we lacked. They were wrong. They owned a version of patience, the long, cold, scheming patience of a civilization that had been managing its competitors for 4 centuries and believed itself to have refined the practice to an art. What they did not have was the other kind, the kind that looks at the arithmetic written in a notebook at 0300 in the dark and decides that it needs no elaboration, only an answer. The kind that runs a production line for 18 months without fragmentation or negotiation or any of the things they had predicted, because the thing being answered does not permit any of those responses. The kind that sits at a station on the analysis deck and watches the shutdown confirmations come in, one system at a time, without rushing and without ceremony, and without any particular expression on its face, because the expression is in the board going dark, not in anything a human face could do. We were patient in that way. They had not included it in their model. I look at the stars on clear nights and I do not feel afraid. The hulls are still in service. The shipyards are still standing, retooled to civilian production but capable of running in the other direction, and everyone in the galaxy who can access a relay signal knows that. The archive we extracted is in the diplomatic record of 31 civilizations. The shutdown confirmations are in the operational archive of every fleet command in Earth's network. The planning document is in the restricted archive, classified until the historians are ready for it. When it is eventually released, the historians will note, I expect, the confident final paragraph. They will note the assessment that humanity was a manageable problem, and they will note what the assessment failed to anticipate, and they will draw whatever conclusions they draw. I could draw them a map, but I think the board says it clearly enough. 900 million units, gone dark in 4 days. 647,000 warships, assembled in silence and sent across the dark as a single, organized fact. That is the answer. That is the whole of it. We do not celebrate it. We do not regret it. We wrote it in the language that the situation required, and the universe received it, and the record now contains it. And anyone who wants to understand what we are and what we are capable of when the conditions change need only look at the record. They sent caretakers into our homes. We answered,